So here's a question for you. When is taking a life not legally considered a murder? I know, it sounds like a riddle, right? But it's an absolutely critical question the law has to grapple with every single day. Today, we're going to dive into a case that put this very question on trial, a story of love, betrayal, and honor that didn't just capture a nation's attention, it actually changed its legal history. Okay, picture this. You have a celebrated, high-ranking naval officer. He finds out his wife is having an affair. So he goes to her lover's apartment, confronts him, and shoots him dead. Seems pretty open and shut, doesn't it? A clear case of murder. But what if I told you that in the eyes of the law, it's way, way more complicated than that? You see, to really get a handle on the legal storm that followed, we first have to understand the human drama at its core. This is the story of Commander K.M. Nanavati. It's a tale that played out in the high society of 1950s Bombay, and it's got everything: love, betrayal, and a fierce code of honor. So let's meet the main players here. You've got Commander Nanavati, a genuine national hero. Then there's his wife, Sylvia, and her lover, a man named Prem Ahuja. The whole thing explodes one afternoon when Sylvia confesses the affair to her husband. What Nanavati does next is what sparks this massive legal debate. He drops his family off at the movies, drives to his naval ship to pick up his service pistol, finds Ahuja, kills him, and then, believe it or not, drives straight to the police station to turn himself in. Okay, so why wasn't this a simple, clear-cut case of murder? Well, the answer lies in this really fascinating legal puzzle. We need to dissect the crucial, and I mean crucial, difference between two terms in the Indian Penal Code: culpable homicide and murder. They might sound like they mean the same thing, but as you're about to see, the distinction can literally be a matter of life and death. All right, let's start with the big one: culpable homicide. The best way to think about this is as the broad family of unlawful killings. It's the starting point. It covers any blameworthy act that causes death where the person knew their actions were likely to have that fatal result. Notice that word, likely. Now, inside that big family, we find murder. This is a specific and much more severe type of culpable homicide. So here's a rule of thumb you got to remember. All murders are culpable homicides, but not all culpable homicides are murders. The key difference? It all comes down to the level of intent and certainty. This table really lays it all out for us. It all boils down to probability and risk. With culpable homicide, the act is just likely to cause death. Death is a probability. But for it to be murder, that bar is set much, much higher. The act is sufficient to cause death, or it's imminently dangerous. We're moving from a possibility of death to a near certainty. It's a huge difference. Okay, with that legal framework in our back pocket, let's jump back to Commander Nanavati. How does all this apply to him? Well, his entire defense, everything, hinged on one very specific legal exception to murder: the argument of grave and sudden provocation. Both the prosecution and the defense focused intensely on this exact sequence of events. First, the confession. Then, the drive to the cinema, the trip to the docks for the gun, and finally, the confrontation. Nanavati's defense team argued this was the timeline of a man who had completely lost his self-control. But the prosecution? They saw the timeline of a man who was methodically planning a murder. And this right here brings us to the core legal question. Look, we all get that people can lose control in the heat of the moment. The law recognizes that. But for that defense to actually work, the provocation has to be both grave and sudden. So was Nanavati's? Or was there enough time for him to cool down? To figure this out, the court used something called the reasonable man test. And this is a brilliant standard, really. The question isn't about what Nanavati personally felt in that moment. Nope. The question is whether any reasonable person from his same background and his exact situation would also have been provoked to the point of completely losing their self-control. And in the end, the court's decision really came down to one single thing: time. The judges decided that the 3-hour gap between Sylvia's confession and the killing was a cooling down period. The drives, going to get the weapon, they saw that as the behavior of someone who had regained control, not someone in the grip of sudden passion. So they ruled the provocation was no longer sudden, and therefore the act was murder. So Nanavati's defense failed. But his argument, the idea that his state of mind should reduce the charge for murder, that wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It's actually one of 5 specific exceptions to murder that are built right into the law. So let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture of how the law tries to account for human frailty.
So, the Indian Penal Code actually lists 5 key situations where a killing might not be considered murder. You have provocation, which we've just been talking about, but it also includes things like exceeding your right to self-defense in good faith, getting into a sudden, unplanned fight, or even certain cases involving consent. Each one is designed to recognize a situation where the person didn't have the cold, calculated intent of a murderer.
So why does any of this matter? I mean, why are we splitting hairs over words like likely versus probable? Well, because when it comes to the real-world consequences to sentencing, the impact of this distinction is absolutely enormous. Just look at this. The difference in the punishment is just stark. A conviction for murder can get you the death penalty or a mandatory life sentence. But a conviction for culpable homicide not amounting to murder, that carries a much, much lighter sentence. We are literally talking about the difference between life and death. And that's because the law is trying to do something incredibly difficult here. It's trying to judge a person's state of mind at the exact moment of the crime. The focus isn't just on the physical act, the terrible outcome, but on the intention behind that act. It's all about separating a horrific result from the specific mindset that drove the action.
A brilliant judge, Justice Vivian Bowes, captured this perfectly in another famous case. He basically said, look, the intention to cause an injury and how serious that injury turns out to be, those are two completely separate things. The prosecution has to prove both. It's not enough to show that the act resulted in death. They have to prove the specific, calculated intent behind it.
Ultimately, the Nanavati case and the law that it tested so dramatically leaves us with this one profound question. In that tragic moment when a life is lost, the law has this immense, almost impossible task of looking into the mind of the killer, to tell the difference between a moment of uncontrollable passion and an act of cold, calculated will. And where that line gets drawn, well, that defines what justice means for all of us.